I don't usually talk about money, not even with close friends. Honestly, the idea of writing this feels strange, almost like I'm breaking a family rule. In my house, wealth wasn't something you flashed around. It was more like the wallpaper, always there, always surrounding you, but never spoken about. I was born into what people call old money. My grandparents had built an empire decades ago, the kind of wealth that doesn't rise and fall with trends. But if you met my parents on the street, you'd probably mistake them for professors or maybe art curators. They dressed in clean lines, neutral colors, and fabrics that whispered instead of screamed. My mom always said, true quality never needs a logo to announce itself. Growing up, I didn't realize we were different. My schoolmates had fancy sneakers, glittering bags, and gadgets I'd never heard of. I thought my parents were just frugal. It wasn't until high school when I started noticing how they traveled, ate, and lived that I realized we weren't normal. While other families booked summer deals on package vacations, we flew private, but not in the flashy Instagram kind of way. No champagne selfies, no loud music, just the quiet hum of an aircraft that looked, from the outside, like any other small jet. Inside, it felt more like a minimalist Japanese spa than a flying hotel. Natural wood, clean lighting, perfectly silent. The kind of place where the absence of noise was the real luxury. My friends bragged about their Gucci belts. My dad wore a watch, so plain it looked like something you'd find in a thrift shop. Only years later did I learn it was a rare Patek Philippe, one of maybe a dozen in existence. He never told anyone, never explained. He just wore it like it was any other watch. That's what quiet luxury is. It's not about buying less. It's about buying in such a way that most people never even know what they're looking at. And honestly, that's the environment that shaped me. I never cared much about looking rich. In fact, I hated the idea of standing out. I learned to value craftsmanship, history, and subtlety over brands and noise. But here's the problem. Outside of my family bubble, the world doesn't work that way. In college, I was surrounded by new money kids. You know the type, first-generation rich, parents in tech startups or finance. They drove Lamborghinis to class, wore Balenciaga hoodies, and treated Instagram like their personal stage. To them, wealth wasn't complete unless everyone else knew about it. I didn't fit in at all. When someone asked what car I drove, I said I didn't have one, which was true. I walked or used ride shares. When someone asked about my outfit, I just said, oh, it's nothing special. I didn't want to explain that my plain-looking sweater was handmade in Florence by a brand most people have never heard of, one that required a year-long waiting list. It was easier to let people underestimate me, to let them assume I was the poor scholarship kid. I didn't mind being invisible. In fact, it gave me a kind of freedom. But everything changed the night. It was a formal gala, one of those glittering high society events hosted in a five-star hotel ballroom. The kind of night where every chandelier is worth more than most people's houses, and the guest list reads like a Forbes article. The invitation came through a college friend whose family was in hedge funds. She said, you have to come. Everyone who's anyone will be there. It'll be fun. Fun wasn't the word I would have chosen. More like dangerous. Because I knew exactly what those nights were like. The loud competition of status symbols, the whispered judgments, the unspoken game of who's richer, who's faking it, and who doesn't belong. And for the first time in my life, I felt torn. Do I show up the way my family raised me? Quiet, understated, invisible? Or do I play the game, flaunt what I've always hidden, and finally reveal the truth about where I come from? That question haunted me in the weeks leading up to the gala. And if I'm being honest, it scared me more than I want to admit. Because deep down, I wasn't just choosing an outfit. I was choosing an identity. The week leading up to the gala felt heavier than finals week. And not because of school or deadlines. This weight was personal, cultural, almost generational. It's funny. Most people panic about what to wear because they don't have enough. I was panicking because I had too much. Too many choices, too many implications wrapped up in each one. For most of my life, clothes have been just that, clothes. Yes, they were expensive, handmade, rare, and sometimes one of a kind, but they were never meant to be statements. In my family, Your outfit wasn't about telling the world who you were. It was about knowing who you were quietly, without explanation. But a gala like this, it wasn't just a social gathering. It was a stage. Every dress, every cufflink, every handbag, it was theater. And whether I liked it or not, I had to choose whether I was going to play along. The night after I got the invitation, I went back home to visit my parents. My mom met me in the hallway, holding a basket of linens. I blurted out before she even had a chance to ask how school was. "Mom, I got invited to this gala." She raised an eyebrow, setting the basket down. "Which one?" I named the host family, and she gave a small smile. "Ah, the Fairchilds. They've always liked their pageantry." I followed her into her dressing room, which, to outsiders, might look like a boutique. Racks of simple, neutral-tone dresses, each draped in protective covers. None of them had logos, none of them screamed money. But I knew. Each piece told a story. Paris ateliers, Milan backrooms, designers who had waiting lists longer than some people's lifespans. I opened one of the garment bags, tracing the seam of a midnight blue gown. The fabric felt like water running between my fingers. "Wear that," my mom said almost offhandedly. "It's too simple," I replied. "Nobody will notice it." She turned to me, a little amused. "That's the point. But what if I hesitated? What if I want them to notice?" That was the first time in years I'd seen my mom pause. She studied me, then walked closer. "You've spent your whole life being comfortable in shadows, darling. If you want to step into the light, do it for yourself, not for them." Her words stayed with me, but they didn't silence the noise in my head. Back in my apartment, I tried on everything. A tailored cream dress that looked plain until you realized the stitching was hand-woven silk. A matte black gown that was so perfectly cut, it moved like it was alive. Even a short, sharp suit that looked minimal but cost more than most cars. Each time I looked in a mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw versions of myself. Versions that the crowd at the gala would interpret differently. If I wore something understated, I'd fade into the background. They'd assume I was poor, a +1, maybe even a mistake on the guest list. If I wore something bold but subtle, an outfit so quiet screamed to those in the know, I'd invite whispers. "Who is she? Why does she have access to that piece?" And if I wore something loud, something brand-heavy, yes, I had those too, gifted by well-meaning relatives, I'd fit in. But I'd also betray everything I was raised to believe. That's the thing about clothing. It's never just fabric. It's armor. And I was about to walk into battle. One memory haunted me while I stood in front of the mirror. Freshman year, a girl in my dorm asked if I wanted to go shopping. We walked into a designer boutique where she squealed over handbags with giant logos. I pointed to a smaller, plain leather piece in the corner, saying it looked nice. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Why would you waste money on something like that? Nobody would even know it's designer." I didn't buy it. But a week later, my mom sent me the exact same bag, unprompted, with a note, "The best things don't need to shout." That bag was still in my closet, pristine, untouched. I picked it up, held it against my side, and wondered if I brought it to the gala, would anyone recognize it? Or would they laugh like that girl did years ago? The days crawled by, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard imaginary voices from the gala. "Who is she? Look at that dress. Off the rack, maybe? Scholarship kid, obviously. She doesn't belong here." But there was another voice, too. Quieter, deeper. My grandfather's. He used to tell me, "Money talks. Wealth whispers." But real confidence doesn't need to say a thing. Was I brave enough to whisper when everyone else was shouting? The day of the gala, my hand shook as I zipped the garment bag closed. I had made my choice, though it didn't feel final until I stepped out of my apartment. I had chosen my mom's midnight blue gown. No logos, no glitter, no embellishments, just fabric so fine it almost looked liquid, and tailoring so perfect it could have been sewn onto my skin. I pair it with my grandfather's watch, simple leather strap, faintly scratched face. To the untrained eye, it looked like a relic from a thrift shop. To the trained eye, it was priceless. And the bag? I took the one from freshman year. The quiet one. The one nobody would recognize unless they really knew. As I slid into the black car that picked me up, I felt like I was walking into a war zone with invisible weapons. The drive to the hotel was short, but every second felt like an eternity. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, and I stared at my reflection. For the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have worn the louder dress. Maybe I should have bought something new just for the occasion. Maybe. But then I remembered something my mom once said at a dinner party when someone complimented her on her understated style. She had smiled and replied, "If you notice my outfit before you notice my words, then I've failed." I held on to that thought like a lifeline. The car pulled up to the hotel, and my stomach twisted. The entrance glittered with flashbulbs. Valets in crisp uniforms opened doors for guests dripping in sequins, diamonds, and metallic gowns. Men adjusted shiny cufflinks and oversized watches, flashing them like badges of honor. I stepped out, smoothing the midnight blue fabric over my body. The air hit me, warm, heavy with perfume, tinted with the smell of champagne. And immediately I fell eyes. Quick glances, subtle scans. Assessments. I could almost hear the silent judgments. Who's that? Plain dress. No logos. My heart pounded, but I forced a small smile, holding my head high. Because this was it. This was the moment I'd been dreading. The moment I'd have to decide whether to blend in or expose the hypocrisy. The moment I stepped inside, the sound hit me first. Not music, not laughter exactly, but that strange blend of clinking glasses, practiced chuckles, and conversations dripping with self-importance. The ballroom was drenched in golden light, the kind designed to make diamonds sparkle and champagne glow like liquid sunlight. Crystal chandeliers hung above us like frozen fireworks, and every surface seemed to reflect wealth back at itself. I walked in slowly, trying not to look like I was searching for approval, but it was impossible to avoid the glances. They weren't malicious, not directly. They were more like quick scans, silent calculations. People here didn't just see you, they measured you. Shoes, bag, jewelry, posture. Every detail filed into an unspoken hierarchy. The first person who approached me was a girl from one of my classes, someone who had never paid much attention to me before. She was in a sequin dress that shimmered like a disco ball, her wrists stacked with bracelets that jingled with every gesture. She looked me up and down, her smile polite but thin. "Oh, you came," she said, as if she were surprised I could afford the entry fee. "I did," I answered simply. She let her eyes hover on my dress for a second too long. "That's very minimal. You always go for that understated thing, huh?" I smiled, pretending not to notice the edge in her tone. "I guess so. It's comfortable." She nodded, already bored, and drifted toward a group taking selfies with a champagne tower. I watched her go, a little sting lingering, but also a strange satisfaction. To her, I looked like no one special. And maybe that was my advantage. As I moved deeper into the ballroom, I noticed how much the room revolved around recognition. People weren't admiring beauty or style. They were admiring brands. Every compliment began with a name. "That's Dior, right? Is that the new Hermes?" "Oh, Balmain, I knew it." The brands were the stars, and the people wearing them were just mannequins. I stood near the edge of the room, sipping sparkling water, trying to decide if I wanted to engage. Part of me wanted to melt into the wall and just observe, but another part, the louder part that had been growing since I got the invitation, wanted to step right into the spotlight. It didn't take long for an opportunity to appear. A group of guys, loud and confident, gathered near me. Their conversation was more like a competition, each one topping the other with a louder story about their cars, vacations, and investments. One of them, wearing a velvet jacket and a watch so heavy it probably left marks on his wrist, noticed me standing there. "You're my econ class, right?" he asked, giving me a quick once-over. "Yeah," I said. He smirked. "Didn't think I'd see you here. Who invited you?" "A friend," I said casually. He nodded like that explained everything. Then his eyes fell to my watch. It was my grandfather's, plain to the point of invisibility, and I could see the dismissive smirk forming before he even spoke. "Cute," he said. "Vintage. Something like that," I replied. He chuckled, already turning back to his group. "Bet you got it at a flea market." Nothing wrong with that, though. I felt the heat rise in my chest. This watch was older than him, rarer than any of their gaudy status symbols, but to him, it was laughable. For a second, I wanted to blurt out the truth, to tell him it was worth more than his car. But I bit my tongue. Instead, I just smiled and sipped my water. He didn't deserve the truth. The night carried on, and the pattern repeated itself. A girl with a rhinestone clutch asked me where my bag was from, and when I told her, she wrinkled her nose. She'd never heard of the brand. Another man leaned close to ask if I was someone's guest because, in his words, I didn't look like the usual crowd. Every time, I swallowed the sting, let the comments wash over me. But with each remark, something inside me shifted. At first, it was anger. Then, it was amusement. Eventually, it turned into something sharper, more dangerous, a desire to turn the whole game on its head. The breaking point came when I overheard two girls whispering near the bar. "She's wearing what silk? Looks cheap. I know, right? Probably borrowed." They laughed, the sound shrill under the music. My hands tightened around my glass. For the first time, I wanted to step out of the shadows my family had raised me to live in. I wanted to see their faces when they realized how wrong they were. And fate, as it often does, handed me the chance. The gala included a charity auction, the kind where items weren't just donations, but symbols of power. Bidders didn't care about the art or jewelry. They cared about being seen bidding. It was theater, pure and simple. When the auction began, I slipped closer to the stage, curious. The first items were predictable: limited edition handbags, rare bottles of wine, diamond earrings. People threw out bids like confetti, the numbers climbing higher not out of passion, but out of pride. Then came the watch, a rare collector's piece, sleek and understated, the kind of item most of the room wouldn't even recognize. But I did. My father owned the same model. The auctioneer described it, and I noticed how the energy in the room dipped. The crowd didn't care. No logos, no sparkle, no Instagram value. The bidding started slow, hesitant. That was when I felt it. The moment. I raised my hand. The room turned, eyes scanning me, curious. Who was this girl in a plain blue gown, suddenly throwing herself into the spotlight? The bids picked up, mostly from older men who actually knew the value. But I kept my hand steady, my voice calm, raising the stakes without blinking. With every number I called, I felt stronger, like I was peeling away the invisible skin I'd been hiding under. When the auctioneer finally slammed the gavel and declared me the winner, the room buzzed. Some looked impressed. Others looked confused. A few whispered. But for the first time all night, they weren't dismissing me. They were seeing me. As the watch was presented, I caught the eye of the guy who had mocked my grandfather's piece earlier. His smirk was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Maybe respect, maybe disbelief. I glanced at my wrist, at the scratched old leather strap, and smiled. I hadn't exposed my wealth with logos or glitter. I hadn't bragged or explained. I had simply acted quietly but decisively. And suddenly, the room seemed different. The whispers shifted. The stares softened. People began approaching me, not with condescension, but with curiosity. One girl asked, "Wait, who are you?" in a tone that was less insult and more awe. I just smiled and said, "Someone who doesn't need a shout." For the rest of the night, I floated through the ballroom with a new kind of confidence. I didn't need to prove anything, not really. But I had reminded myself that I could. That was enough. As the music swelled and the night deepened, I realized something important. Luxury isn't about the price tag, or the recognition, or the noise. It's about the quiet certainty that you know your worth, even when nobody else does. And as I left the gala, slipping back into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The sunlight shimmered across the ocean that morning, 1,000 little diamonds dancing on the waves, and I remember thinking how strange it felt that such beauty could ever be boring. But when you grow up in circles where the extraordinary is your daily wallpaper, the extraordinary begins to lose its bite. A friend of mine, well, I should say, the son of one of my father's longtime business partners, had called to invite me to what he proudly labeled the yacht event of the year. His tone was heavy with pride, as if he had personally purchased the vessel. In truth, the yacht belonged to someone else, a newly minted tech billionaire who'd been plastering his fortune across every social feed like he was auditioning for a reality show. I wasn't interested in being a guest at yet another spectacle where money screamed louder than music, but something inside me tugged. Maybe curiosity, maybe a desire to see if people like that, people who had worked and clawed their way into riches, would behave differently from the old money circles I grew up in. Or maybe I was just tired of hiding, tired of keeping my life neatly folded like an unused suit in a wardrobe. I told him I'd come. Arriving at the marina, I already knew I'd made a mistake. Flashbulbs popped at the entry. Influencers posing dramatically against the polished rails. Champagne glasses held at angles, designed more for Instagram than thirst. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and even one gold-plated Rolls lined the street. A parking lot worth more than some nations. My driver looked at me in the mirror, waiting for permission to roll forward. I almost told him to turn around, but something in me hardened. I stepped out of the car, linen shirt half untucked, sandals soft against the ground. No flashy watch or jewelry. Heads turned, not in admiration, but confusion. In this circus, you were either peacock or pigeon, and they didn't know which one I was yet. Boarding the yacht was like stepping onto a floating palace designed to feed insecurity. Every corner dripped with an excess that screamed, "Look, I've arrived." Gold trim on door handles, velvet cushions that felt more suited for a mansion than the open sea, entire walls of chilled glass holding wines older than most of the guests. People strutted in clusters, forming mini red carpets wherever they went. Men compared cars like schoolboys, showing off baseball cards. Women's handbags were lifted, twirled, and admired like trophies. Every sentence I overheard contained a price tag. At first, I blended into the background. I leaned against the rail, sipping a soda, watching the horizon stretch endlessly. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to ignore the looks. I could feel people's eyes flicker over me, their brows arching in silent judgment. No Rolex flashing from my wrist, no designer logos splashed across my chest. One woman, her nails perfectly sculpted, tilted her head and asked, "So, who brought you?" As if the only way I could possibly be here was as someone's forgettable plus one. I smiled, shrugged, and gave no explanation. It wasn't worth the effort, but the moment sank deep into my skin like a thorn. For so long, my family had drilled into me the value of subtlety, of living wealth quietly, of never needing to shout because those who mattered already knew. Yet in this environment, silence felt like erasure. Later in the evening, after too many champagne toasts and an obnoxiously loud DJ set, I found myself cornered in conversation with three men, each of them draped in designer suits, so sharp they looked freshly sewn onto their bodies. They were showing off watches, comparing bezels, swapping stories about who had the better limited edition. I listened, half amused, half exhausted, until one of them glanced at my bare wrist and smirked. "No watch. What happened? Couldn't find one on sale." His friends chuckled, and it was like déjà vu, the same mocking tone I'd heard at the gala, the same assumption that worth could be weighed in metal and leather. This time, though, the anger didn't just simmer. It boiled. I thought of the watch I had left at home, my grandfather's piece, rare enough to make collectors salivate. I thought of the cars parked outside, some of which my father's companies had quietly funded through early investments. I thought of the yacht itself, whose owner once sat in my father's office, nervously pitching an idea, desperately hoping for seed money that eventually launched him into the stratosphere. And here I was, being treated like the outsider. I wanted to snap, to lay down the truth like a royal flush on a poker table. I wanted to tell them my family's history, our legacy, the kind of wealth that didn't need parading because it had been built across generations, not overnight. But as the words pressed against my throat, something stopped me. I saw them more clearly than ever. Boys in suits, hungry for validation, desperate to be seen. Their laughter wasn't cruelty. It was insecurity in costume. The louder they flexed, the more fragile they appeared. And suddenly I felt the strangest thing, pity. So instead of unleashing my truth, I smiled, lifted my glass, and said, "You're right. Couldn't find one shiny enough." Then I walked away. The morning after the yacht party, I woke to the sound of silence. Not the heavy kind that presses down on you, but the rare kind that feels like a gift. My phone, though, had no intention of keeping the peace. It buzzed nonstop with notifications, photos, tags, messages from people I hardly knew, but who had seen me in the background of someone else's curated night. They wanted to know who I was. That single question pulsed across my screen like an echo. Who is he? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I didn't know the facts, my family's name, our history, the quiet empire my grandfather had built brick by invisible brick, but because I wasn't sure anymore if I wanted that to be my answer. Maybe the better question was, who am I without all that? The world I had grown up in was made of whispers. My parents never wore designer brands that screamed across the chest. Their homes were never featured in glossy magazines, though they could have on the cover. They taught me that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, that strength lies in restraint, that true luxury is the ability to choose silence when everyone else is shouting. But over the last few weeks, faced with the relentless noise of people trying to prove themselves through labels and things, I had felt that silence twist into something heavier, something that looked too much like invisibility. It was late afternoon when I got a call from my mother. Her voice was calm, deliberate as always. She asked if I was coming to the foundation dinner that evening. Not another gala, not a circus, just a dinner held by our family's trust, funding scholarships and healthcare initiatives. A room full of people whose names would never trend, whose stories would never go viral, but whose lives we touched quietly without announcements. I told her I'd be there. The dinner was held in a modest hall, nothing extravagant, though every detail was executed with perfection. White tablecloths, simple floral arrangements, soft music that never tried to steal attention. The guests weren't dripping in diamonds or posting their plates online. They were teachers, doctors, community workers, students, people whose value couldn't be measured by a logo on their wrist. And as I sat there, listening to a young woman talk about how a scholarship allowed her to be the first in her family to attend college, I felt something shift inside me. All the noise from the gala, the watch, the yacht, it suddenly seemed so fragile, so empty. I remembered the man who mocked my wrist, the woman who asked who brought me, the influencers counting likes under neon lights. Their entire identity was built on being seen. But this room? This room was built on something else. Legacy, impact, meaning. And it hit me. I had been measuring myself against the wrong scale. Halfway through the evening, one of the students came up to me. He was nervous, hands fidgeting with the edge of his blazer, clearly not used to speaking with someone like me. But he looked me in the eye and said, I just wanted to thank you, not just for the scholarship, but for making me feel like I belong here. Belong. That word struck me harder than anything else had. At the gala, I didn't belong because I wasn't flashy. On the yacht, I didn't belong because I didn't play the game. But here, in this quiet room, stripped of show, I belonged without having to prove a thing. Later that night, driving home through the quiet streets, I thought about everything I had witnessed. The hypocrisy, the vanity, the insecurity hiding under silk and gold. I thought about the temptation I had felt, the urge to prove myself, to pull the curtain back and expose the truth. And I realized I didn't need to. Hypocrisy has a way of exposing itself if you stand still long enough. But I also realized something more personal. My silence, my family silence, had always been about dignity. Yet somewhere along the way, I had mistaken it for weakness, for absence. What I saw now was different. Silence was power. Power not to be dragged into competitions that never end. Power not to explain yourself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. Power to decide where you do belong and where you don't need to. The next day, my phone buzzed again. More whispers, more curiosity. People asking who I was, why I hadn't posted, what brand my clothes were. I typed one response, simple, deliberate, and sent it to a friend who had been at the yacht. Not everything needs a label. Some things just are. I never explained further. Weeks passed. The noise faded. New parties, new outfits, new faces to mock or admire. But something stayed with me. That image of the young student, grateful not just for opportunity, but for belonging. That word anchored itself in me like a compass, pointing me toward a quieter but truer kind of wealth. And so I chose not to blend in, not to expose, but to live in that rare space where I didn't need to perform for anyone, where my worth wasn't tied to logos or applause. Where the loudest thing about me would always be the silence I carried, unshaken, untouchable. That is the real luxury. Not yachts, not watches, not diamonds, but the freedom to not care if anyone sees them at all.